Darius Knox thought the rain would wash away his sins. He stood on the desolate, mud-slicked back road, looking down at Zariah Cole's unconscious form with a smug, cold satisfaction. Her dark red shirt was soaked through, her natural curls matted against the wet earth, and her breathing was shallow, barely a whisper against the roar of the deluge. Darius wiped the fresh blood from his knuckles onto his jeans, convinced that by morning, Zariah would be nothing more than a tragic headline. A bankrupt, jobless woman who couldn't handle the pressure and met an accidental end in the storm. But as Darius turned to walk back to his car, a sudden, primal chill bypassed the cold of the rain. He felt it before he saw it, the weight of a gaze so heavy it felt like a physical strike. Just 30 feet away, illuminated by the ghostly amber glow of an idling black SUV, stood a man who didn't belong in the mud. Kang Junseok, a formidable Korean mafia boss, watched with a predatory seriousness that made Darius's heart stop. Junseok wasn't there by accident. He had been tracking Darius's massive, unpaid gambling debts for months, cataloging every theft and every coerced loan Darius had used to destroy Zariah's life. Darius didn't know it yet, but the moment he raised his hand against Zariah was the moment his own life ended. He thought he was the predator of this road, but he was currently standing in the crosshairs of a man who turned blood money into cold-blooded justice. Stay tuned, because the real nightmare for Darius Knox is only just beginning, and Zariah's transformation from a broken victim to a woman of power is a journey you have to see to believe. Before we proceed, I would love to know where you are watching from. Drop it in the comment and also subscribe to this channel if you are new here. Now let's dive into the story. The rain was a rhythmic, static curtain that blurred the lines between the asphalt and the encroaching forest. Kang Junseok sat in the driver's seat of his matte black SUV, his posture as still and precise as a machine. To anyone else, the stormy night would have been a chaotic hazard, but to Junseok, it was merely data, a set of variables that dictated the visibility and movement of his target. He adjusted the gain on his dashcam feed, the high-resolution monitor displaying the exterior of Darius Knox's battered truck 100 yards ahead, casting a ghostly glow across his structured masculine features. Junseok didn't believe in coincidences, and he certainly didn't believe in the chaos that defined men like Darius. For 3 months, he had treated Darius as a persistent error in his ledger. The man was a parasite, a small-time gambler who operated with the reckless incompetence that usually ended in a shallow grave long before the debt was fully collected. He had watched, through the lens of long-range cameras and the reports of his surveillance team, as Darius systematically dismantled Zariah Cole's life. It had been a slow, methodical erosion. He had watched the arguments in the apartment doorway. He had seen the way Darius's hands, often balled into fists, betrayed a temper that no amount of money could tame. He had tracked the financial trail, too. Darius was a glutton for debt, and he had used Zariah as his personal credit line, siphoning the funds she earned to cover his catastrophic losses at the illegal tables until she was bankrupt and jobless. Junseok viewed the entire ordeal with the detached clinical interest of a scientist observing a rot. He wasn't there to save Zariah. He was there to ensure that when Darius finally collapsed under the weight of his own greed, the collateral damage to the syndicate's local fronts was minimized. Zariah was, in his initial estimation, merely a variable in an equation, an asset that was rapidly depreciating under the strain of a distressed mindset. Tonight, the variable shifted with a sudden, violent finality. Through the high-resolution feed, he watched the argument erupt on the desolate stretch of the back road. Darius had pulled the truck over, his movements jagged and aggressive, his athletic frame silhouetted against the downpour. Zariah stood her ground, her natural curly hair already soaked and clinging to her dark red shirt, before the shove sent her staggering into the wet grass. Junseok felt a prickle of genuine, cold-blooded irritation. Darius was sloppy. He was emotional. He was creating a scene that attracted unnecessary attention, and that was the one thing Junseok could not abide. He watched, his knuckles resting lightly on the steering wheel, as Darius circled her like a predator who had finally realized the prey was trying to bolt. He saw the slap, the way Zariah's head snapped back, and the subsequent strike that sent her crumbling to the asphalt. It was a failure of control, a clumsy, desperate act of violence that marked the definitive end of Darius Knox's usefulness. Junseok narrowed his dark, intense eyes, his gaze locking onto the motionless form of the woman in the rain. She lay there, a fragile thing that had been broken by a man who didn't even understand the value of what he had destroyed. Junseok shifted the SUV into gear, the leather-wrapped shifter clicking into place with a sterile precision. The engine purred, a sound of restrained, lethal power that cut through the hiss of the storm. He had waited months for the moment when Darius would make a mistake so public, so irredeemable, that no amount of begging could earn him a reprieve. This was it. He tapped the touchscreen, logging the coordinates of the assault into his private database with the same predatory seriousness he applied to all his business dealings. The game had shifted from surveillance to extraction. He watched Darius climb out of his truck and approach Zaraya's unconscious form, his posture radiating that toxic, aggressive confidence. Junseok didn't need to hear the words. He could see the intent in the way the man moved. He reached into his coat and straightened the lapel of his tailored black suit, his movements unhurried and decisive. The debt was no longer just about the money Darius had stolen from the gambling dens. It was now about the ledger, and the ledger required a balance that only true dominance could provide. He began to roll forward, his headlights remaining off, a black ghost gliding through the deluge toward a man who had no idea his time had finally expired. The black SUV glided to a halt 30 feet from the scene, its engine a low, rhythmic vibration that seemed to synchronize with the pounding rain. Kang Junseok stepped out of the vehicle, his tailored black suit immediately darkening under the deluge, yet his movements remained measured and decisive. He didn't run. He walked with the quiet authority of a man who already owned the ground beneath his feet. Darius Knox, still standing over Zaraya with a smug, false dominance, didn't hear the approach until Junseok's shadow eclipsed the amber glow of the truck's headlights. Junseok didn't offer a word of warning. As Darius turned, eyes widening in a sudden, jagged terror, Junseok's gaze remained dark and intense, a clinical assessment of a threat that had already been neutralized in his mind. The predatory seriousness in Junseok's eyes made Darius stumble backward, his aggressive confidence evaporating into the cold night air. With a subtle tilt of his head, Junseok signaled to the two silent figures who emerged from the SUV behind him, his private security detail, moving with the same mechanical precision as their boss. "Extraction," Junseok said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that cut through the hiss of the storm. He knelt beside Zaraya, ignoring the mud that ruined his expensive trousers. Her deep, warm brown skin was pale, and her soaked curls were plastered against a face that held a distressed, unconscious expression. She was fragile, a victim of a man who viewed her as a resource to be siphoned dry, but Junseok saw the underlying resilience in the set of her jaw even now. He pressed 2 fingers to her neck, finding a pulse that was weak and thready, barely clinging to life against the rising cold of the 2:00 a.m. rain. His private medical team moved in with surgical efficiency. They didn't use sirens or flashing lights. Their equipment was unmarked, and their movements were designed to leave no digital footprint. They stabilized her on a portable stretcher, administering a heated IV drip to combat the hypothermia that was already setting into her slim frame. There would be no hospital records, no police reports, and no trail for the debt-ridden Darius to follow. In Junseok's world, invisibility was the ultimate shield. As they loaded Zaraya into the back of the SUV, Junseok stood up and turned his sharp, focused gaze back toward Darius. The gambler was frozen, his muscular frame trembling not from the cold, but from the realization that he had stepped into a trap he didn't even know existed. Darius had spent years siphoning Zaraya's life, siphoning her career and her bank account until she was bankrupt, but tonight he had finally drawn from a well that was poisoned. "You think the storm hides what you do," Junseok stated, his voice devoid of emotion, a cold-blooded psychological strike. "But I have been watching you for months. I have seen every cent you stole and every bruise you left." He took a step closer, his broad shoulders squaring as he invaded Darius's space. "You owe the syndicate for the embezzlement at the docks, and now you owe me for the mess you've made on my road." Junseok didn't wait for a response. He watched as his men forced Darius into the second vehicle, a silent decree of the labor that was to come. The quiet authority he projected was absolute. There was no room for Darius to bargain or plead. As the vehicles pulled away, leaving the deserted back road empty and silent once more, Junseok sat in the back of the SUV beside Zaraya's unconscious form. He watched the rhythm of the heart monitor, his intense eyes never leaving her face. He was her silent benefactor now, the man who would provide the elite care she needed to survive, but he would remain at a clinical distance. She was no longer a depreciating asset. She was a survivor he intended to rebuild from the ground up. The rhythmic beep of the high-tech medical monitor in the present dissolved into the sharp, aggressive ringing of a telephone from a year ago, the sound that had signaled the beginning of the end. In the memory, Zaraya sat at her mahogany desk in the high-rise office of Vance Global, her oval face illuminated by the soft glow of a computer screen she had spent 18 hours a day mastering. She was an ambitious strategist then, her future a straight line toward the executive suite, until Darius Knox became the anchor that dragged her into the depths. It had started with small emergencies, a short-term loan for a business venture that didn't exist, a car repair that was actually a payment to a bookie, a forgotten utility bill that was really a lost hand at an underground table. Darius was a master of siphoning, a parasite who knew exactly how to weaponize Zaraya's loyalty and her belief in his muscular, athletic frame. He didn't just take her money, he took her peace, showing up at her office with a smug, cold irritation whenever she dared to question the 3% variance in their joint accounts. Methodical erosion turned into a landslide when Darius began taking out loans in her name, forging her signature with a reckless incompetence that only a desperate gambler possesses. Zaraya had been forced into bankruptcy not by her own hand, but by the weight of a man who viewed her as his personal credit line. She remembered the day her HR director called her in the clinical, cold tone as they explained that her high-level security clearance had been revoked due to her financial instability. Darius hadn't just made her go bankrupt, he had made her a liability. By the time Zaraya was jobless, Darius had moved from siphoning her accounts to siphoning her soul. He monitored her phone, tracked her movements, and ensured her distressed mindset kept her trapped in their apartment. He would stand over her with that aggressive confidence, his masculine features twisted in a smug smirk as he told her she was lucky he stayed, that no one else would want a woman who had lost everything. The flashback sharpened into the night she finally tried to bolt. She had found a hidden ledger, his real ledger, showing the massive unpaid gambling debts he owed to the Korean syndicate. She realized then that he wasn't just losing her money, he was stealing from the very people who ruled the dark underbelly of the city. She had packed her bag, her dark red shirt trembling as she realized the man she once loved was a monster of his own making. Darius had caught her at the door, his posture radiating a false dominance that turned violent the second he realized his resource was escaping. "You aren't going anywhere, Zaraya," he had growled, his jawline tight with a rage that surpassed his usual irritation. "You're my insurance. You're my way out." The memory fractured as Zaraya's eyes fluttered in the present, the soft beige light of Junseok's safe house pulling her back from the abyss of her own history. She was no longer in that apartment. She was in a fortress of iron and silence, a place where the quiet authority of her benefactor ensured that the parasite could never reach her again. But as she felt the ache in her ribs and the weight of her bankruptcy, she knew that the empty account wasn't just a financial reality. It was the hollow space where her life used to be, waiting to be rebuilt by the man who had been watching the rot from the very beginning. The storm had slowed to a persistent, icy drizzle by the time Darius Knox pulled his battered truck onto the interstate, the engine whining as he pushed the vehicle toward the city limits. His hands gripped the steering wheel so hard his muscular forearms throbbed, his eyes darting frantically to the rearview mirror. Behind him, the road was a dark ribbon of wet asphalt, seemingly empty of witnesses or retribution. Darius allowed himself a jagged, breathless laugh that lacked any real mirth, his masculine features twisting into a familiar, smug smirk. He was convinced he had outrun the chaos he'd left in the mud. He believed the quiet authority he had encountered in the rain was just a ghost of the storm, a man who wouldn't follow a nonentity like him into the dark. He was wrong. Exactly 3 car lengths back, a matte black SUV glided through the shadows, its headlights killed to blend into the velvet gloom of the highway. Inside, Kang Junseok sat in a dangerous calm, his dark, focused eyes never leaving the swaying taillights of Darius's truck. He wasn't chasing, he was harvesting. To Jun Seok, Darius was no longer a man but a parasite whose movements were now entirely dictated by the syndicate's invisible hand. He watched Darius weave through the light midnight traffic with a clinical detachment, letting the gambler believe he was free. Every lane change and every panicked glance Darius cast over his shoulder was being logged into a high-resolution dashcam feed, documenting the anatomy of a man who was already dead, but simply hadn't stopped breathing. Jun Seok reached out, his long, lean fingers tapping a command on the central console. A map flickered to life, showing the real-time location of Darius's truck alongside a detailed list of the illegal gambling dens Knox frequented. Jun Seok knew exactly where Darius was going. A cornered rat always returns to the hole it knows best. Darius wasn't fleeing the city. He was scurrying toward the high-stakes table at the Obsidian, hoping one last win would cover the embezzlement debts he owed the syndicate and buy his way out of the assault he'd committed in the rain. "Let him play," Jun Seok murmured, his voice a low, predatory rumble. "Let him think the deck is in his favor." He watched as Darius took the exit toward the industrial district, the truck's tires splashing through rising puddles. Jun Seok maintained his clinical distance, a silent benefactor of a very different kind. He had already arranged for the medical team to report Zaraya's stability to his private line, ensuring the woman with the underlying resilience was safe before he finalized the ledger. Now, his focus was entirely on the predatory seriousness of the hunt. He followed Darius into the labyrinth of rusted warehouses, the SUV moving with a measured, purposeful pace that contrasted with Darius's jagged desperation. As Darius pulled into the gravel lot of a nondescript building, his posture still radiating that false, aggressive confidence, Jun Seok brought the SUV to a silent halt in the deep shadows of a nearby loading dock. He watched through the rain as Darius adjusted his leather jacket, checked his clean-shaven jaw in the mirror, and stepped out into the night, convinced he was the master of his own fate. Jun Seok didn't move. He sat in the darkness, the light of the dashboard illuminating the sharp jawline and high cheekbones of his structured masculine features. He would let Darius experience the thrill of the bet one last time. He would wait until the moment the cards were dealt and the air grew thin, and then he would step out of the shadow to show Darius exactly what true dominance looked like. The trap was set, the debt was being called, and the predator was finally ready to claim what was owed. The air inside the Obsidian was thick with the scent of stale tobacco, expensive cologne, and the sharp, metallic tang of desperation. Darius Knox sat at a circular baize table, his muscular frame hunched forward as he squeezed his cards. His short-cropped hair glistening with a light sheen of sweat under the low-hanging industrial lamps. He had just pushed a massive pile of chips into the center, money he didn't actually have, backed by promises to men who didn't take IOUs lightly. His expression was one of smug, aggressive confidence, the face of a man who believed the quiet authority from the rainy backroad was 1,000 miles away. "Call," Darius growled, his jawline tight as he looked at the dealer, a man whose impassive expression mirrored the cold stone of the warehouse walls. The heavy iron doors at the back of the room swung open with a slow, deliberate creak that silenced the low hum of the gambling den. Kang Jun Seok stepped into the light, his tailored black suit pristine despite the chaos of the night, his measured steps echoing against the concrete floor. He didn't look like a gambler. He looked like a predator who had finally arrived to claim a stray lamb. The room's atmosphere shifted instantly, the predatory seriousness in his dark, focused eyes causing the other players to lean back, instinctively sensing a tier of dominance they couldn't compete with. Jun Seok walked directly to Darius's table, stopping just behind the man's chair. He didn't say a word at first, simply reaching out to adjust the cuff of his black dress shirt, the motion revealing the lean power in his forearms. Darius froze, the card slipping slightly in his trembling hands as he recognized the structured masculine features and the intense gaze of the man who had watched him in the rain. "You're playing with borrowed time, Darius," Jun Seok stated, his voice a low, clinical rumble that carried more weight than a physical blow. He reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out a small, high-definition tablet. With a flick of his thumb, he turned the screen toward the table, displaying a crystal-clear loop of the rain-slicked backroad. The footage showed Darius standing over Zaraya's unconscious form, his athletic frame silhouetted as he wiped blood from his knuckles with a cold, smug satisfaction. The collective gasp from the other gamblers was the sound of a man's alibi shattering into a million pieces. "I don't care about your debts to these small-time tables," Junseok continued, his gaze narrowing as he leaned down, his broad shoulders casting a shadow that swallowed Darius whole. "But you owe the syndicate for the siphoning of the Vance Global accounts, a total debt that your life wouldn't cover in 10 lifetimes. Darius tried to stand, his false dominance flaring into a desperate, jagged anger. "You can't prove." Junseok's hand moved with a speed that defied his calm posture, his fingers locking onto Darius's leather jacket and forcing him back into the seat with a strength that felt like forged iron. "I have watched you for 3 months," Junseok whispered, his face inches from Darius's, his dark eyes reflecting a dangerous calm that promised no mercy. "I have every coerced loan, every forged signature, and every strike you landed on a woman who was too good to ever belong to a parasite like you." The Mafia boss straightened his jacket, his expression returning to its usual controlled seriousness. He looked at the dealer and gave a subtle, decisive nod. The illegal game was over, not because the cards were finished, but because the real owner of the debt had arrived to collect. Darius sat paralyzed, the aggressive confidence of a bully replaced by the hollow realization that the quiet authority he had mocked was now the only force between him and the shallow grave he had earned in the rain. The heavy iron doors of the warehouse annex slammed shut with a finality that echoed like a gunshot, sealing Darius Knox into a space where the rules of the civilized world no longer applied. The room was cold, lit only by a single flickering bulb that cast long, predatory shadows across Kang Junseok's structured masculine features. Junseok stood in the center of the concrete floor, his tailored black suit as pristine as it had been in the rain, his posture radiating a quiet authority that made the air in the room feel thin. Darius sat bolted to a metal chair, his athletic frame trembling with a jagged, desperate energy. The smug, aggressive confidence he had carried through the gambling den had evaporated, replaced by the hollow realization that he was no longer the predator. He looked at Junseok, his eyes darting frantically, searching for a gap in the Mafia boss's clinical armor. "You have spent 3 years siphoning a life that didn't belong to you," Junseok began, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that cut through the silence. He paced slowly around Darius, his measured steps clicking rhythmically against the floor. "You took Zariah Cole's savings, you took her job, and tonight you tried to take her breath in the rain." Junseok stopped directly in front of him, leaning down until their faces were inches apart, his dark, intense eyes reflecting a dangerous calm. "In my world, debt is a physical thing," Junseok whispered, the predatory seriousness of his gaze locking Darius in place. "The money you embezzled from the syndicate's local fronts is one ledger. The damage you did to an asset under my surveillance is another." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a single sheet of paper, the collector's terms. Terms were brutal. Junseok didn't want a simple repayment plan. He wanted a total claim. Darius was to sign over every asset he had left, which was nothing but the clothes on his back and the truck he'd used to intercept Zariah, and then he was to be handed over to the syndicate's brutal debt collection labor camps. It was a sentence of endless, grueling work in the shadows of the industrial docks, a life where he would be a non-entity, working to pay off a debt that would likely outlive him. "The alternative," Junseok continued, his voice devoid of emotion as he straightened his suit jacket, "is the shallow grave you already dug for yourself on Route 47. Darius looked at the pen Junseok held out, his masculine features twisting in a grimace of pure terror. He thought of the rain, the way he had stood over Zariah with a smug satisfaction, believing he was untouchable. He realized now that he had been a parasite playing a game with a man who dealt only in absolute dominance. I can get the money," Darius stammered, his voice cracking, the false dominance finally shattered. "Just give me another week." Junseok didn't even blink. He simply signaled to the 2 large, silent men standing by the door. "You've had months of chances that you threw away at the tables," Junseok stated with a clinical finality. "Tonight, the ledger closes. Choose the pen or the shovel." The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the sound of Darius's shallow, panicked breathing. He looked down at his clean-shaven hands, the knuckles still bruised from the assault in the rain, and realized that every bridge he had ever built had been burned by his own gambling habit. There was no escape, no alibi, and no mercy coming from the man in the tailored suit. With a shaking hand, Darius reached for the pen. As he scrawled his name, effectively erasing his own existence from the world above, Junseok watched with the patient focus of a man who had finally balanced an equation. The aggressive abuser was gone, replaced by a broken man who would spend the rest of his days understanding what true consequence felt like. Junseok took the signed document, tucked it into his pocket, and walked toward the exit without looking back. He had a different project to attend to now, a woman with an underlying resilience who was currently waking up in a world where her nightmare had finally been neutralized. The collector had finished his work, and the silent benefactor was ready to begin his. The clinical beep of a medical monitor had been replaced by the rhythmic, muted hum of a high-end climate control system when Zaraya Cole finally opened her dark brown eyes. She didn't find herself in the sterile, cramped quarters of a public hospital, but in a sprawling master suite that felt more like a fortress of glass and silk. The walls were a soft, warm beige, and the floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of a city she no longer recognized as her own. A gilded cage where the rain was a distant memory, visible but unable to touch her. Zaraya tried to sit up, a sharp ache in her side reminding her of the muddy back road and the distressed expression she'd carried into the darkness. She gasped, her slim frame trembling under a weighted silk duvet, and it was then that she noticed the man sitting in an armchair by the window. Kang Junseok was a silhouette against the city lights, his tailored black suit perfectly pressed, his posture radiating a quiet authority that commanded the room even in the stillness. "Don't move," Junseok stated. His voice a low, clinical rumble that felt like a stabilizing anchor in her sea of confusion. He didn't stand immediately. He simply watched her with intense, dark eyes that seemed to catalog her recovery with predatory seriousness. Zaraya's breath hitched. She remembered the black SUV, the amber glow, and the dangerous calm of the man who had stepped out of the storm. "Who? Where is Darius?" she whispered, her voice cracking as the residual fear of 3 years of abuse flared in her chest. Junseok stood up, his unhurried, measured steps bringing him to the side of her bed. He looked down at her, his sharp jawline and high cheekbones casting a shadow that was protective rather than predatory. "Darius Knox is paying a debt that he can never fully settle," Junseok said, his tone devoid of emotion. "He will never be a variable in your life again. I have closed that ledger." He reached out, his lean but powerful fingers adjusting the control of the medical equipment beside her bed with mechanical precision. "You are in a secured residence," he continued, his gaze narrowing as he studied her oval face. "You were bankrupt, jobless, and left for dead by a man who didn't understand your value. I am your benefactor now. I have provided the elite care your resilience requires." Zaraya looked at the man she now knew as her guardian angel, feeling a strange emotional contrast. He was the definition of true power, yet he maintained a clinical, protective distance that felt like a shield. "Why?" she asked, her dark eyes searching his for an agenda. "Because I do not tolerate the siphoning of assets I am tracking," Junseok replied, his voice a low vibration of quiet authority. "And because you showed more courage in that rain than the man who tried to break you." He turned to leave, his black dress shoes silent on the plush carpet. "Rest, Zaraya Cole. When you are ready to rebuild what was stolen, the resources will be waiting." As the heavy mahogany door clicked shut, Zaraya lay back against the pillows, her heartbeat finally settling into a steady rhythm. She was still in a cage, but for the first time in years, the bars were made of iron and gold, and the man who held the key was the only one she didn't have to fear. She watched the light of the city flicker against the ceiling, realizing that while her old life was bankrupt, this new world, silent, clinical, and guarded, was where she would finally learn to breathe again. The silence of the penthouse was no longer a heavy, suffocating weight, but a clean slate that Zaraya Cole was finally beginning to fill. 2 weeks after waking in the secured residence, the bruises on her cheekbones had faded to faint yellow shadows, and the underlying resilience that had once been buried by Darius's abuse was now her primary compass. She stood in the center of a newly converted home office, the scent of expensive leather and fresh technology replacing the damp, metallic air of her past. The room was a masterpiece of quiet authority, designed by a man who understood that a fortress was only as strong as the mind operating within it. Kang Junseok stood by the window, his tailored black suit casting a sharp, purposeful silhouette against the morning sun. He didn't offer comfort, he offered infrastructure. On the obsidian desk sat a state-of-the-art workstation, a secure satellite phone, and a portfolio of corporate identities that bypassed the bankruptcy Darius had forced upon her through years of coerced loans and theft. June Seok's presence was a dangerous calm, a clinical reminder that while the world outside saw a bankrupt woman, the man in this room saw a high-value asset being meticulously restored. Your record at Vance Global was erased by Knox's incompetence, but your talent was not, June Seok stated, his voice a low vibration of quiet authority that filled the expansive space. He turned slowly, his intense, dark eyes locking onto hers with a predatory seriousness that was now focused on her success rather than her survival. I have cleared the administrative hurdles. These are the tools of a strategist, not a victim. Zaraya ran her hand over the cold metal of the laptop, a tool that felt like a weapon in the war to reclaim her agency. She knew that Darius had spent years siphoning her career until she was jobless and destitute, but June Seok was providing a foundation that was unshakable. She thought of the empty account of her past, the forged signatures, and the gambling debts that had turned her name into a liability, and realized that June Seok was effectively writing a new ledger for her. "The bankruptcy, the loans he took in my name," she whispered, her dark brown eyes meeting his structured masculine features. She was searching for a catch, the distressed mindset of a survivor still whispering that every gift had a hidden price. "They are irrelevant," June Seok replied, his sharp jawline set in a decisive line. "In this world, credibility is built on results, not bank statements. My security team will ensure your movements remain a shadow to those who would seek to drain you again." He maintained his clinical, protective distance, a silent benefactor who understood that true power was the ability to build something from zero. He didn't want her gratitude. He wanted her dominance in the professional world to mirror his own in the shadows. Zaraya looked out at the city, no longer a passenger in a vehicle careening toward oblivion, but a woman with a fortress and a mission. The high-end residence was no longer just a place to hide. It was the headquarters of her second act. She realized that June Seok wasn't just giving her a job or money, he was giving her back her underlying resilience. He was providing the elite care that allowed her to move past the distressed expression and toward a predatory seriousness of her own. She was bankrupt in the eyes of the law, but as she looked at the silent man in the black suit, she realized she was now backed by a force that the law couldn't even touch. Every piece of software on the desk, every secured line, and every guard stationed at the perimeter was a barrier between her and the parasite who had tried to break her. Darius Knox had left her in the deluge to die, but Kang June Seok had brought her into the heights to reign. "I won't fail," Zaraya said, her voice finally losing its threading, weak quality and finding its natural strength. "I know," June Seok replied simply, his gaze unblinking. He walked toward the door, his measured steps a testament to his quiet authority. "The first contract is already in your inbox. Prove the ledger right." As the door clicked shut, Zaraya sat at the desk, the blue light of the monitor reflecting in her dark eyes. The rebuilding had begun, and for the first time in 3 years, she wasn't running, she was calculating. 6 months had passed since the rain on the back road had nearly claimed Zaraya Cole's life. But tonight, she stood in the center of a glass-walled boardroom on the 50th floor, overlooking the same city that had once tried to swallow her whole. She was no longer the bankrupt, jobless woman who had been left for dead in the deluge. Dressed in a sharp, tailored blazer that mirrored the predatory seriousness of her benefactor, she had just successfully closed the acquisition of a tech firm, the very same firm Darius Knox had once tried to dismantle for gambling money. The underlying resilience that Kang June Seok had identified in the mud was now a sharpened professional edge that commanded the room. The high-stakes corporate victory was a major career milestone, a definitive sign that she had rebuilt her life from zero. The executive she had outmaneuvered shook her hand with a respect that felt earned, unaware that the woman before them had once been a passenger in a vehicle careening toward oblivion. Zaraya smiled, but it was a dangerous, calm smile, one that she had learned from the man who lived in the shadows. She watched them file out, her dark brown eyes reflecting the city lights like a predator assessing a new territory. As the room emptied, Zaraya noticed a small, unmarked package sitting on the polished mahogany table, a gift that had bypassed every layer of top-tier security without a single alarm being raised. She knew the signature of such a delivery before she even touched it. It carried the quiet authority and clinical precision of the man who had been her silent benefactor. Kang Junseok didn't use common couriers, he used ghosts. Inside the box was a single, heavy silver coin from an underground gambling den that had been shuttered months ago, its surface engraved with a series of coordinates. Accompanying it was a note on expensive, heavy paper. "The ledger is balanced. You walk in the light now. I remain in the shadows to ensure the light never fades. You are safe. T.S." It was a final, undeniable proof of his protection. A reminder that while they walked in entirely different worlds, he was always watching, a silent watcher who ensured that her nightmare could never return. Zaraya walked to the window, the silver coin cold and reassuring in her hand. She looked down at the streets below, where the rain was starting to fall again, but for the first time in years, she didn't feel the distressed mindset of a victim. She thought of Darius Knox, now a nonentity paying his debt in the syndicate's labor camps, and realized that her guardian angel had not just saved her life, he had restored her soul. The penthouse residence, the workstations, and the elite medical care had all been tools, but the real gift was the silence, the freedom from fear. She was an empowered woman who had survived the worst the world could throw at her, and she knew that the man in the tailored black suit would always be there, a lethal guardian ensuring her freedom. Junseok maintained a clinical, protective distance, yet his influence was the iron skeleton of her new reality. She was finally free, walking faster than her past, while her silent sentinel kept the darkness at bay. Zaraya placed the silver coin in her pocket, a talisman of her new life, and looked out at the storm. The rain didn't wash away sins in her world. It merely tested the strength of the fortress you built after the flood. She was Zaraya Cole, no longer bankrupt, no longer jobless, and never again a victim. As she left the boardroom, the security team Junseok had provided stepped into formation behind her, measured, purposeful, and silent. They were the physical manifestation of the predatory seriousness that now guarded her milestones. Zaraya didn't look back. She had a corporate empire to run and a life to live, and she knew that somewhere in the velvet gloom of the city, Kang Junseok was watching the monitors, ensuring the variables always remained in her favor. The ledger was closed, the debt was paid, and the parasite had been removed. Zaraya Cole stepped into the elevator, the doors closing with the same finality as a coffin lid for her old life. She was moving toward the light, backed by the most dangerous man in the shadows, and for the first time, she knew exactly what true dominance felt like.